Access, access, united we're strong. We won't go away because we know you're wrong. Access, access, you've had your way too long. We're here and we're gonna stay.
Hi, I'm Lynn Pedotto with ADAPT Chicago Productions. Today we have as our guest Amber Smock. She is the Director of Advocacy for Access Living. Amber is active in many disability rights issues and an integral voice of the Going Home campaign, a coalition that supports the closing of the Murray Development Center. Welcome, Amber.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great.
Good.
In 2012, Governor Quinn introduced the Rebalancing Initiative. What is it and why is it important for people with disabilities in Illinois?
That's a great question, and it's a question that sometimes is confusing to a lot of people who aren't familiar with the issues. When Governor Quinn introduced the Rebalancing Initiative, his goal was twofold: to better improve the way that we spend money on long-term care services for people with developmental disabilities, and also to look towards actually shifting Illinois from a system that depended on large state-run facilities for people with developmental disabilities to a system that depends on community-based services and in-home services for people with disabilities. So what it is he decided that he was going to close a specific number of state-operated developmental centers, and he also planned to close a mental health center as well. And so the idea is those will produce cost savings, but a lot of that money is also supposed to follow those people in the community to support their community-based services. What this means for people with disabilities in Illinois is that the state is saying, we think that what you want is important, as opposed to the state saying, this is what you're going to do. So the idea was to provide an opportunity for caseworkers and staff and families and people with disabilities to get together and really design a support system based on the family's needs and the person's interests. So before that, we really didn't have a proactive effort to do it. And so this is very exciting, and it's really the leading edge of disability rights in Illinois, because our system serves many different kinds of people with disabilities in a fractured sort of way, meaning that people with developmental disabilities get services over here, people with mental health issues get services over here, people with physical disabilities get services over here. Well, a lot of people have some of more than one. And the question is, how do we really develop a system that applies to everybody? And you have to start with shrinking down the large state settings and really expanding home and community-based service options. And all of that is what I hope will lead towards a better, more holistic service delivery system in Illinois for people with disabilities, and a greater and more expanded infrastructure for home and community-based services. So the Rebalancing Initiative is not just about the closure of the Murray Developmental Center. It's really about how is Illinois going to do better for generations to come. It's no longer acceptable to many families these days to say, well, actually, I guess it's okay to send my child off to a state institution and not see much of them, and they're 500 miles away, and people are just going to do what they want to do. Now more families are saying, I want my adult child with a disability or my adult sibling with a disability to live close to me, to have the same kinds of options that I do, to do things like go to the store, have a job, pick what you want to eat, go on vacation. People with disabilities want the same things that people without disabilities want, but you can't have that kind of setup in a large state-run facility. So the Rebalancing Initiative is about many things, but I see it as a beginning to a new stage of life in Illinois for people with disabilities.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be very beneficial in the long run. Why do you think there's been pushback from families such as those at Murray and probably other families? Do you think it's just fear of change, or is there something else going on?
There's no doubt that there's absolutely pushback against the Rebalancing Initiative, especially by families of people who are currently living in a state-operated developmental center. It's very stressful to be in a situation where you have made a plan and you've said, well, this is where my son or daughter or sibling is going to live, and they're taken care of and everything's okay and I don't have to worry about them. and then to have the state come back and say, well, actually, we're changing the game plan. And to do it the way that the state has, closing one institution after another, like one at a time, what's happened is that sometimes people also get bounced around from one institution to another. So that just the basic stress of the game plan has changed, in addition to the fact that some families may have experienced having their family member with a disability bounce around between facilities. Absolutely, that's a huge problem. But I think that people also need to remember that research and the experience of people who have moved into the community shows that they are happier, that they have more options, that the families are pleased with the outcome. And so the initial stress, even though it may be really overwhelming, actually leads to something good. But the key is that families need to dialogue with people who have options to offer. So if you're so stressed out and overwhelmed that you're just going to shut down and you can't pay attention to what the choices are, that's not really benefiting the person with the disability. You have to be able to open up and listen to what's going on. And I would recommend that people say, hey, what is it that I can do to make sure that my family member with a disability goes to a stable place in the community rather than being shuttled around from facility to facility. People also should keep in mind that because there are 14 other states that don't have large state-run facilities, it's not possible that Illinois is somehow the state that has the most severely disabled people in the world. Those states support people who have very severe disabilities, just not in large state facilities. So how can Illinois do what they're doing? And I think there's a lot of effort towards that. And right now, I think there are a lot of advocates and a lot of service providers involved in trying to find the best possible setup for people who have come out of the Jacksonville Developmental Center and for the people who are coming out of Murray. And, when I hear a leader of a developmental disabilities organization telling me that he's spending 75% of his time on finding suitable placements for people in the community, I mean, that's dedication. They're not kidding around. They really are trying to find the right kinds of supports for people. So when you ask the question, what do you do with this emotional pushback? I ask people to look at what the end results are supposed to be. I ask people to look at what community-based settings are really supposed to be about. People should always demand the best possible supports. I totally agree. I think the people who need to do the demanding are not just family members, but also legislators and community members. Everybody needs to have a part in making sure that this works out for the best. So,
oh, wow. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think it will be beneficial.
Good.
In the
Great.
long run.
Me too.
So, besides the closure of the state developmental centers, what are some other steps involved in this rebalancing initiative? Okay. Well, the core of the actual rebalancing initiative, as introduced by the governor, is the closure of a couple of the state-operated developmental centers and the mental health center. So, but supporting that is also the fact that Illinois is now participating in programs provided by the Affordable Care Act. So there's Medicaid expansion, which is also about supporting more people with health care. Better health care means you can live in the community. There are waiver programs that are being examined that may provide better options for long-term services and supports. I think Illinois is essentially right now in the midst of a tidal wave of change, and we really have to be careful that we're making the best value-driven judgment about what's best for people with disabilities. And we need to make sure that people with disabilities are included in this process, and that they have a voice at stakeholder meetings, and that their family members have a voice as well. And I think what we have to be doing is looking and say, where in this process could people be possibly discriminated against or treated in an unequal manner, etc. So the changes in healthcare that we're seeing right now are giving us an opportunity to do that. And it's all supporting the Rebalancing Initiative, because the Rebalancing Initiative is not an idea unique to Illinois. Rebalancing is a word that really means, in the broader policy sense, the moving of Medicaid long-term care dollars from funding nursing facilities and institutions to funding home and community-based services.
So right now, Illinois spends about 35% of its Medicaid long-term care dollars on community-based services, and about 65% on nursing facilities and institutions. Those places cost more. So imagine if we moved about 15% of that money to home and community-based services, how many more people with disabilities we could serve with that money. So that's what rebalancing in the bigger picture means, and that's what we are pushing Illinois to consider, to expand its vision from just the specific rebalancing initiative to the broader sense of really rebalancing our state as a whole with its disability services.
Well, how do we ensure that people with disabilities and also their families have a voice in this process?
Sure. Well, first of all, there are usually public hearings that have to do with the closure process, so that's important. But the state also makes it very clear that families can contact them. So my understanding is that when a facility is closed, the families are communicated with, notified that there's going to be a closure, and offer an opportunity to work on a person-centered plan. There is also a website called the Going Home Illinois campaign, which you briefly referred to. And the Going Home campaign is not just about talking about the rebalancing initiative, but it's also a gateway to say, hey, there are options in the community, you should check it out. So I really recommend going to goinghomeillinois.org to look at the stories on there, the information on there, and start thinking about who can I contact to find out how to support my family through this transition. So I think that's one of the first things that people absolutely need to be able to do. Unfortunately, I think fear and worry and stress make people have the reaction of, you know what, no way, I don't want anything to change. And I'm going to pursue legal action, and I'm going to fight as hard as I can to make sure nothing in this situation changes whatsoever. But the fact remains that the highest level of spending that the federal government has spent on large state-run institutions peaked in 1992. So for more than 20 years, the United States has been working towards spending less on institutions. And that's a fact that's been proven over a couple of decades. So given that there's no end in sight to the downward amount of spending, we need to look at expanding those community-based services. And I wish people understood that, but I also know that it's very easy not to be aware of these facts the way that advocates are.
Well, and besides the fact that funding has gone down since 1992, I read that many of our institutions are horribly outdated, some dating back to the Civil War, portions of the building. So is that something that's also being stressed? Because I haven't really read about that as much, about how antiquated these institutions are.
If you think about the times we live in now and the past 2 centuries of disability history, what's happening is that we're moving from a social attitude towards disability, that disability must be hidden, it must be shut away. And starting in the 1940s and 1950s, families began to change that attitude. Families began to say, well, actually, I want my son or daughter to live at home with me, or I want my son or daughter to live close. I want them to be a part of our community and not just hidden away. And there are so many families that have horror stories of sending someone away, and then the siblings have never heard of them until after they die. And that's traumatizing. So I think that we're moving away from that model to something where people with disabilities are seen as part of the community, they're included, etc. I think that that's the future of the disability movement. I think that we're also getting stronger protections in the law. So the Americans with Disabilities Act and Title II, it contains the community integration mandate. So any services that are provided that are funded through state or federal money have to be provided in the most integrated setting. That's the community integration mandate. And that's the basis on which the Olmstead 1999 Supreme Court decision was made. A lot of people look at Olmstead and think that Olmstead was filed over the choice about where to live. And that's true in a sense, but Olmstead, the spirit of Olmstead, was really about allowing people with disabilities the choice to live in the community. It was not about allowing people with disabilities the choice to live in an institution. Medicaid makes it mandatory for all states to provide an institutional level of care. But Olmstead is about the community living side of it, and people should be very clear on what that is. So,
What about the rural areas? Are there also plans being developed for community living arrangements in the more rural areas of the state?
Well, right now, I don't have a lot of information directly on what's being developed in rural areas of the state. I think that it's important to do that. I think that's where a lot of families live, and I think that that's where a lot of the SILAs should be. I know that developmental disabilities organizations are saying that right now they're seeing the greatest growth in SILA network expansion that they've ever seen before. So that's good. It's a growth industry. But I think we have to make sure that the SILA workers are well paid. I think that's really important. That's a disincentive to people who, for example, work at the Murray Developmental Center. And they say, I don't want to work at a SILA because the pay is a lot less. So we really need to make sure that SILA workers are paid well so that they'll really support people who live there. I think, so the growth thing is important. I also would have to say that legislators who have state-operated developmental centers in their districts are well aware that they have state-operated developmental centers in their district. And my message that I've been trying to get through to them is that, so you have this responsibility in your district, and you know what happens when somebody announces that such a facility is going to close. You need to be ready for this. You need to be sure that in your community there are community-based services that those people can transition to. Transition can't be a lie. It has to be a real transition to living the life that you want to live. And so I really urge legislators to do everything they can to expand home and community-based services, especially in rural areas. So,
yeah, I think that's really where so many services are needed anyway.
Yes.
In the rural areas, they're lacking. There isn't access to even social groups, social organizations for people with disabilities. So they definitely need to be thinking ahead for those areas. Now you said the legislators, you encourage them to be thinking ahead. Is Access Living doing a lot of lobbying or educating other legislators?
Yeah, we've been working quite a lot recently to educate legislators about the options available for expanding home and community-based services in Illinois. Legislators are certainly aware that state funding is a key part of this, and that protecting the state funding for existing services is really important. Legislators who have SODCs in their district are aware of the same thing, but it's not always clear how you're going to go forward with expanding home and community-based services in the area. And something that I've talked to legislators about is that there's an option under the Affordable Care Act. It's called the Community First Choice option. And it would provide Illinois with federal matching funds to be able to serve anybody with a disability who needs home and community-based services. Sounds good to me. I mean, we have 30,000 people supposedly on the developmental disabilities waiting list for services. How do we get rid of that list? I'm happy to see the system change and be better at serving people, but if we don't get rid of the waiting list, we really can't say we're coming out ahead. So I think legislators need to be aware of those dynamics. I think legislators need to ask themselves the question, how do we best serve people with disabilities in the state of Illinois? All of them. I'm fine with taking step-by-step action towards, making sure that everybody is served. But really, what is your vision for serving everybody? And that's what I would challenge legislators to think about.
Yeah, well, hopefully they will.
Yeah.
Sounds like a big job for them and a big job for you and Access Living to educate them and just get things moving in the right direction. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you. And thank you for joining Adapt Chicago Productions. I'm Lynn Pedotto.
I want choices and rights. Choices and rights. Choices and rights in my life. I don't want your charity. Are you to be paid to care for me? I want choices and rights in my life. And I don't want to be in your care or to be put someplace out there. I want choices and rights in my life. Choices and rights, that's where we gotta find. in line.